Now, the first speaker for this plenary session we have Dr. Garima Dalal. Before I hand over this virtual podium to ma'am, I'll briefly sum up her literary scholarship. Dr. Dalal is an associate professor of linguistics, teaching English for academic writing to research scholars and postgraduates at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. She was the first to introduce the concept of mind mapping to Indian scholars in 2010 during a capacity building program at JNU. Dr. Dalal completed the Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages methodology course with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, USA, sponsored by the US Department of State. She recently coordinated a virtual exchange program on sustainable communities with the University of Texas, Dallas, USA. In November 2023, her contribution towards gender-inclusive communication was recognized by Srimati Smriti Irani, the then Honorable Minister of Women and Child Development, as a part of the policy document for all training officers at Lal Bahadur Shastri Training Academy, Mussoorie. Over the years, Dr. Dalal has imparted exceptional unconventional English language and linguistic techniques for the past 17 years in various international universities like South Asian University by SAG and national universities like Jamia Millia Islamia and Delhi University, New Delhi. She has been a resource person to many national and international organizations and universities like the University of Essex, United Kingdom, and the Staff Selection Commission, Government of India, along with assisting in speech and language therapy at the National Health Services, UK. Dr. Dalal has authored several research papers and books on various aspects of ELT. It is my now honor for me to invite our first distinguished speaker, Dr. Garima Dalal, who will deliver her lecture on Beyond Copy-Paste, a taxonomy of thinking as an antidote to plagiarism. Dr. Dalal, the virtual floor is yours now, and we are looking forward to your talk on the topic.
Thank you, Professor Tiwari, esteemed colleagues, fellow educators, friends. It's a privilege for me to address this plenary, and I'm genuinely grateful to the organizers, especially Dr. Manish Kumar, for inviting me and allowing me to place this question. What do we do about plagiarism? And what plagiarism is really a sign of? And this is going to be the center of our conversation today. I want to use my time with you to say that, to say something that I think will be probably uncomfortable for some, and that I have come slowly and with reluctance to believe is true. So let me begin not by a definition, but with a question. When a student plagiarizes, what is it that they truly lack? Is it integrity? Or is it the cognitive tools to read, to think, to write independently? We have answered this question for too long in one way or the other, but let's be honest, we have treated plagiarism as a moral failing to be detected and punished. I suggest that plagiarism is far more often a cognitive failure than an antidote, than the antidote that is not surveillance but thinking. So this is the proposition I wish to defend over the next half an hour, and to defend not in the abstract, but with reference to the classrooms we actually teach in, the regulations we actually operate under, the students that we actually teach in our classrooms. So in context to that, I would like to go ahead. I argue in essence three things. So the first is that the way we have framed plagiarism for the last 25 years has been diagnostically wrong. Second, that the framework that we need to think about has actually been sitting on every teacher training syllabus since the middle of the last century. And third, that India of all countries has the most to gain by getting this reframing right. And we are also the most to lose by getting it wrong. Now, plagiarism is neither new nor uniquely Indian. The global response to it has been overwhelmingly technological. If we date back, Turnitin was founded in 1998, and its similarity detection software became worldwide standard for our academic integrity. And now, for nearly a quarter of a century, this single piece of software has come to define what we today carry to mean by academic integrity. Now, to be a good teacher in this implicit definition was to submit one's student's work to a database and trust the percentage it returned. Isn't that? So the pedagogical question that follows is, what kind of thinker is this student becoming? And this was quietly displaced by the actual question, that is, how much of this text that the student is submitting to us, it overlaps with the text that we have seen before. The displacement between these two is so gradual and so general that most of us, myself included, did not notice it happening. Now, coming to November 2022, we have ChatGPT. It puts a fluent text generator into the hands of every student with an internet connection, and the problem suddenly grew and blew up overnight. Now, in its first year of analyzing the student writing, Turnitin found that roughly 11% of the papers contained at least 1/5, which is 20%, of likely AI written text, and about 3% were overwhelmingly machine generated answers. Now, those numbers, alarming as they are, they tell us only one part of the story that detection can see. The fraction of student work shaped by AI is almost certainly larger, and it is simply better disguised. That's all. So institutions everywhere kind of responded the way they always have, by purchasing better detectors. And yet detection treats only the surface. So where teaching has replaced policing, the results differ sharply. Now, plagiarismcheck.org in 2025, they have reported that plagiarism in final submissions fell from 80% to 15% after a single writing ethics workshop. Mind you, 80 to 15% after a single workshop. So I want you to hold that figure in mind, because it suggests that the cognitive work that we have been outsourcing to a software was all along the work our students were ready to learn, if only we had thought of teaching it the correct way. So the global lesson is already visible. The real question is whether India will choose to learn it. The lesson is available. We have the data. But what remains is the institutional will. Now, why India cannot afford to ignore this? Let us be honest. We know India is the largest education system on earth by sheer institutional count. More than 1,100 universities, over 45,000 colleges, more than 2 lakh students enrolled in doctoral programs. And behind those numbers stand the largest cohort of our young scholars that any country has ever attempted to educate at once. So India will produce in this decade alone more graduate writers than the entire population of, let's say, European nations. Now, whatever pedagogy we settle on will scale to a magnitude no other higher education system has had to think about. The scale of this kind magnifies every weakness that we have. If you look at a 2024 survey by an Indian research by a Indian researcher on Indian research students. It found that 31.1% of the students, Indian research students, they did not recognize content similarity as plagiarism. Let that figure rest for a moment. Nearly 1 in 3 of our most advanced students cannot identify the very thing our regulations are built to police. And this is not a survey of incoming undergraduates. These are research students, men, women, girls, boys who have already cleared a master's degree, who are in the middle of producing a thesis, and nearly a third of cases cannot reliably distinguish a paraphrase from a plagiarism. So the gap is not at the entry point of the system, it runs full length of it. And this is not for the want of national attention to artificial intelligence. The India AI mission was funded of at least 2,000 crore rupees in the union budget of 2025-2026. That is 156% increase over the previous year's budget estimate. Now, AI is a national infrastructure, mind you, and our students will not use less of it next year. They will use a great deal more. Let us be prepared for that. So the cognitive challenge that we have before us is not going to recede on its own. So we, in other words, are building a generation of researchers who have access to these generative tools. It will exceed anything that previous generations could have imagined, while they could have simultaneously discovered that their training, independent of the thought, has not kept pace with the current times. But that gap is an entire subject of this lecture itself. So let us look at the regulatory response and its limitations. India has not been passive. 2018, UGC came up with the regulations of on academic integrity, a mandate to check similarity similarity checks for these theses, these dissertations, and they were set out at 4 graduated levels of plagiarism, ranging from minor revision at low similarity to cancellation of a student's or a candidate's registration when it exceeded 60%. So more recently, Indian institutions have begun treating unacknowledged AI content that is generated by students as plagiarism, even though the 2018 regulations predate the generative tools entirely. So by any measure, this is a detailed and serious framework. I do not say this dismissively. The 2018 regulations were a real achievement. They named the problem. They set the thresholds. They assigned the consequences. Yes. For an academic culture that for decades has treated plagiarism with a shrug, they were long overdue for an act of seriousness. And yet the framework is already straining because Indian universities have begun rejecting doctoral theses which are found to contain unattributed AI-generated content. The reason is structural. From end to end, the architecture is one of detection and penalty. It tells a student that copying is forbidden, but it does not teach them what should the student do instead. So it is basically addressing the symptom, but it is leaving the cause untouched. And that cause is cognitive. It has shaped the law. It was shaped long before the student actually reached the university to meet us. Across those 12 years of examination-driven schooling that rewarded accurate reproduction far more than independent thought. That's what we made our students. So imagine for a moment what it has cost a student whose doctoral thesis is rejected at the very end on the grounds of AI-assisted plagiarism. Years of work, financial sacrifice on part of a family. Some students postpone their marriage, postpone their career. All of it is undone at the Viva. So we owe such students, and they're not few, the honesty of asking whether the system has produced them, ever taught them what it then punished them for not knowing. So in most cases, I submit it did not. Bottom line is, to name the cause precisely, I turn to a framework that is itself global. So Benjamin Bloom and his colleagues set out their taxonomy of cognitive objectives in 1956. Anderson and Krathwohl revised it in 2001. Now it is worth pausing on the date 1956. 1956, before personal computer, before internet, before the very idea of generative AI. A framework that was written for us, that the world has somehow become, that the world already had, we all had, but it has become the most useful map that we possess, especially for the educational predicament that we are going through today. And that is not because Bloom and his colleagues were astrologers. Right? It is because they were asking the only question that finally matters. What is it exactly that we want our students to be able to do with their minds? So the 2001 revision is not cosmetic. Bloom's original arranged the highest cognitive level as evaluation. Anderson and Krathwohl moved create to the apex, recognizing that the act of producing something genuinely new is most demanding when it comes to cognitive operation of a learner and how he performs it. So that single change should govern how we set every assignment that we give. Yesterday's plenary by Professor Robert from Tokyo did have these questions, but there were no answers. So today in this plenary, I want to give those answers, right? That single change should govern how we set our assignment that we give to our students. It describes these 6 ascending levels of thinking. First 3 are remember, understand, apply. These are called LOTS, lower order thinking skills for those who are new. And the next 3 are analyze, evaluate, and create. These are higher order thinking skills, HOTS. I've written for quite some time on these, right? So these are skills on which genuine scholarship depends. This is the single most important diagnostic table that one can offer. If you have a look, we have set a question that asks students merely to recall a definition, restate what a textbook paragraph says. Levels 1 and 2. Now, we have designed an assignment that any research engine or search engine or AI or any paraphrasing tool or any LLM model, large language model, can complete on a student's behalf. Now, plagiarism in such a setting is not a moral lapse, but it is a path for least resistance for a student. Move the question 1 or 2 steps higher. Analyze, evaluate, create, and the same tools, they become aids rather than substitutes. So the cognitive work cannot be outsourced and copying loses its point. So allow me to elaborate this on the next slide. Now here is the central insight. Copying a passage is an act of retrieval. I'm just going and retrieving some information, the very first level of taxonomy. Right now, running that passage through a paraphrasing tool like a Quillbot. It was quite popular. I don't know if it's popular today or not. Right? It gives only a stimulated version of the second level. But neither of them actually even touches upon the skill of analysis, evaluate, or create. The plagiarizing student is not a thief. So much so as a student stranded at the bottom of the cognitive ladder. The point is clear. when we see the same failure in two students in two continents? Let's say I ask a British undergraduate to write on the causes of the First World War, and the weak response opens a search engine, quickly lifts a paragraph from an encyclopedia, reorders a couple of sentences, and ask an Indian postgraduate to write on the partition of 1947, and precisely the same thing happens. A Wikipedia paragraph, few words changed here and there, and a submission. What neither student has done is cognitive work. Neither of them have weighed the Mountbatten plan against the position of Congress Working Committee, nor has it set Aisha Jalal's interpretation of partition against Mushir Hassan's. So plagiarism is not a crime. It is the visible trace of thinking that has never happened. It is absent, in absentia. The research confirms this directly. Toker and Akgun, they designed an assessment task at varying levels of cognitive complexity. And they found that AI-assisted plagiarism fell steadily as task complexity rose. So the higher order questions are not merely harder to cheat on. They resist cheating because they demand a kind of thought that no tool can supply on the student's behalf. I still remember the day 2003 to 2005 when I was a master's student in GNU. And our professors, we had an open book exam. You read any book, but you would not find the answer if you've not understood that concept. That finding, the finding of Toker, that finding ought to reframe our every conversation that our institutions are having about AI detection. The question that we should be asking is not how we can catch the student who has used the tool, but what kind of questions would we have to make so that the tool becomes redundant in the first place? The answer the research suggests is level 1 or level 2 higher on the taxonomy scale. Now, the taxonomy is valuable because it does two things at once. Diagnostic, it lets us ask at what cognitive level a given task and a given student are operating. And it is prescriptive in the sense that once we see that a task sits on this level, 1 or 2, we know exactly what to do. Redesign it to 1 or 2 levels higher. Now, this is not a foreign imposition on Indian educational system. NEP 2020 already calls for a decisive shift towards from rote recall, summative examinations towards competency-based higher order assessment. The policy speaks of conceptual understanding, critical thinking, creativity, because it explicitly aims at every stage of schooling to get these skills polished for students. Now, it calls for the abolition of high-stake board exams as principal organizing logic of secondary education. Now, read alongside Bloom, this amounts to national commitment to higher order learning. So what it has been missing is the bridge from policy aspiration to, let's say, classroom practice. So Bloom's taxonomy simply gives that policy a very concrete and classroom ready method, which currently is not available or is missing. Now, a rule can forbid a behavior. I make a rule, forbids a behavior, right? It cannot build the capacity that makes the behavior unnecessary. So let's say picture a child who copies a classmate's arithmetic, right? He's copied some sum that the teacher gave. So we are not curing the student of the habit by writing a stern rule against copying. We cure it by teaching the child to do the sum. How do you add? How do you multiply? Right? Our universities face the same truth on a larger scale. Even if I consider today the coaching institutions that millions of Indian students pass for UPSC, JEE, NEET examinations, I know, I don't want to comment, right? So they succeed not because they police cheating, but because they teach problem solving relentlessly until the student can alone do those, right? Rather than requiring some outside help. I do not hold up the coaching industry as a model of liberal education. It is not. But it carries a pedagogical lesson which is worth our attention. That those classrooms do not contain a single anti-cheating poster. They don't need to. A student who has been taught to solve the problem has no use of someone else's solutions. Right? Integrity in those classrooms is not a value imposed from outside, but it is a byproduct of the competence built from within. And that is the lesson our universities have not yet absorbed. So this is why enforcement without scaffolding is hollow. India has among the most detailed academic integrity regulations in the world. Yet, AI plagiarism continues to surface in doctoral thesis. The lesson is not that our rules are weak. No. It is that the rules alone were never going to be enough. Integrity is a cognitive capacity, capacities that need to be built, not merely demanded. Now, coming to my area of English for academic purposes, if integrity is to be scaffolded, my perception is some part of the curriculum must do the scaffolding. And I argue that EAP is the natural home for this work. Even in my university, in the linguistic empowerment cell where I'm teaching, we are considered in the same light. But I want to say EAP is not remedial grammar. It is not a service course for correcting punctuation. At its best, it is disciplined teaching of the thinking that scholarship requires and the stages of a genuine academic writing task that maps almost perfectly onto the Bloom's ladder that I talked about. So for too long, EAP has been treated in the Indian academia as something between a service course and a soft option. Basically a place where students are sent whose English is judged inadequate. They are taught by faculty whose own status within the institution is too rarely commensurate with the difficulty of the work. So I want to challenge that perception directly. EAP, if it is properly understood, is not the room where the deficient student is fixed. It is the room where cognitive practices of scholarship are explicitly named, modeled, they're built, and they're built on need base for every student, not just for those students whose English is not a first language. So this table that you can see, it actually maps the actual stages of writing a piece of scholarship onto Bloom's cognitive ladder. So you see EAP isn't grammar, it's about thinking, teaching thinking in sequence. We have comprehension sources to understand, which is the entry level student. First must grasp what a text generally is arguing, not just what its sentences say. Paraphrasing and summarizing is the path between moving from understand to analyze, the hinge. If done well, this is not synonym wrapping. They're not swapping synonyms. I know I'm hungry. This is not synonym swapping, but it is rebuilding the meaning of a passage in one's own structure. Comparing different sources is analysis. Right? The student now holds two or more texts side by side. He's reading, mapping where they agree, where they pull apart, where is each one of them silent. and evaluation, where you are building an argument. You are a cartographer to advocate, taking a position, taking a stand, defending it with its alternatives, right? And last is making an original contribution, creation, the topmost, where you are producing your scholarly insight that did not exist before the student wrote. So if you read bottom down, the column is a definition of scholarship, what a real scholar actually does, and top down, it is a syllabus. So it functions in both ways, right? Now moving on, the AI question. None of this means we should fear artificial intelligence. AI did not create the problem of plagiarism. It is industrialized problem, right? That is already there. An AI generated paragraph is in taxonomic terms, level 1, artifact, fluent retrieval of nobody's ownership behind it. But at this very same tool, used well, can be a thinking partner. Yes. So Gonzalez in the Journal of Marketing Education found that generative AI can both enhance and challenge critical thinking depending on the cognitive level at which students are asked to engage with. The design of the question decides what the outcome is. For example, let's say I ask a student to discuss the significance of Bhakti movement, and an AI will answer it completely and competently. The task lives at level 2, and it is frankly not worth setting, isn't it? Ask instead, to what extent Kabir's poetry challenge the fixed religious identity? Ground your argument in 2 specific verses. Engage at least with one dissenting scholar's view. Right now, the AI can assist, but it cannot author, because the task demands a position from the student that he must hold and he must defend. So that question lives at level 5. And it is in its truest sense plagiarism resistant. Right? So the lesson is not to ban the tool. It is to raise the level of your questions. If you take a contemporary example, you ask a student to explain provisions of DPDT, right? So an AI will produce a couple of papers that the act says, right? But if you say compare the 2 acts, it'll argue, right? So now AI can only offer raw materials. It cannot do a comparison. It doesn't have a judgment. It doesn't have a position. So the question itself does the work. No policy is required on AI in case you can frame your questions well. So moving ahead, plagiarism as a symptom and not disease. Now this is reframing. This reframing asks us to challenge how we read a plagiarized paper. We must stop assuming that every instance is deliberately dishonest. Our students are not deliberately dishonest all the time. Let us be very clear. I'm pro students in this. So in practice, only a minority, perhaps 15 to 20%, is willful deceit or deception, right? But we must be honest about what it means to mistreat the other 80%. So a student who has copied because they were never taught to paraphrase, and who is then accused of dishonesty rather than offered instruction, he has to be taught something. But not what we intended, right? He is taught that dishonesty is punishment. No, they have to be taught that the institution sees them as a suspect rather than a learner, right? So I want to change that definition. They have been taught that the right response to confusion is concealment. If you cannot convince them, confuse them. Remember? And very often, they have been taught to leave the academy altogether. So the pedagogical and ethical costs of that mistake are very difficult to overstate. The far larger share is cognitive unpreparedness. We are cognitively unprepared. Let us be honest. Students who were never explicitly taught to paraphrase, to synthesize their sources together, to take or defend positions on their own. This is what we've made our students. They can't make their own choices. But if we treat that majority as criminals, we miss the single greatest teaching opportunity in front of us. And the evidence that teaching works is now substantial. In a systematic study by Daniel in 2025, he analyzed 158 students, 158 studies, found that 94% actually reported significant gains in cognitive skills, including critical thinking, problem solving, analysis, when AI is integrated pedagogically rather than completely banning it. So the disease is not the tool, nor is it the student. It is the pedagogy that has to be stopped by asking our students to think. Now, coming to the solution from the classroom of JNU's empowerment cell, let me make this concrete with 3 tasks that I use personally at LEC in JNU. Each is designed to do one thing, that is to move the student up the cognitive ladder. And how I do it, right? Until plagiarism becomes not merely forbidden, but it becomes pointless for them at one point in time. So I share these not as templates to be imported, but as worked examples of a method. Every one of you in your own discipline, in your own institution, can design something similar, which is better suited for your students. What matters is that it is the principle, right? The form can be local. So the first one. So we begin by dismantling a myth that paraphrasing means swapping words from for their synonyms. A thesaurus can do that. So can Quillbot. And the result is level 2, right? Real paraphrase is comprehension by rebuilding in one's own words. So we give students a dense sentence. For instance, I give them a sentence. Digital platforms have recognized, have reconfigured the terms of political discourse, collapsing the distinction between public deliberation and private expression. Now, before they rewrite a single word, they must answer these 4 questions. What is the central claim of this statement? What does each of the term actually mean? What is the author assuming? And do I agree? And why do I agree or why I don't agree? Only then do they rewrite. And the rewriting has become an act of analysis rather than substitution. So we use this simple analogy. Copying a sentence is like photographing a field of wheat, dhan ki photo, while understanding it is like knowing how this wheat grows. And you remember in school, when we were in nursery, we were actually made to go take a plate, take cotton, take some moisture in the cotton, and then put some seeds, and we saw it grow. One captures a surface, the other follows a process. We learn the process. The second method, now for every source they read, the students, they build a 4-column table. So I asked them to make a 4-column table, right? The first is the source, which source they've got it from. What is the main claim of the source? What is the evidence or method that they're using? And what is their assessment, my assessment? So the first 3 columns are comprehension and analysis. They read and they do it. Now the 4th column is very interesting. My assessment is where I ask the students how they must evaluate. Do they agree? Do they dissent? Do they qualify with reasons? They have to have reasons. And this column, mind you, column sits at level 5 of Bloom's taxonomy. And this is the column precisely which cannot be filled by AI on students' behalf, because it requires a judgment that only the student can actually hold. My third illustration is AI critique. Now, finally, we hand students an essay generated by AI, right? So for instance, on federalism in Indian Constitution, We do not ask them to write on their own. We ask them to critique it. So we basically ask AI to write, we give it to them, and we ask them to critique it. Now tell us, where is the argument thin? What has it left out? Has it left out something? What is it? What claims would not survive scrutiny? So students who can dismantle an AI essay can never again be fooled into submitting one to you, because they have learned to see exactly what such an essay lacks. So the tool becomes the object of higher order thinking skills, HOTS, rather than a substitution for it. Let me back my claims, because I know I'm a bit, I will take 2 or 3 more minutes. 3 findings anchor everything that I've said. Toker and Ekigan showed that higher order tasks measurably reduce AI. Wasson talks in the English journal 2 decades ago that Bloom's taxonomy could be used to teach students about plagiarism directly by deliberately walking them up the cognitive ladder. And plagiarismcheck.org's fall from 80 to 15% in the European Journal of Education. Reviews 94% converges to one conclusion. The conclusion is, when we teach thinking, integrity follows. So my quick recommendations for teachers and EAP practitioners here: redesign your assessments to operate on Bloom's levels, higher levels specifically, like analysis, evaluate, create, rather than on lower levels of remembering and understanding, right? If you want to teach plagiarism summarizing as explicit cognitive skills, teach them as cognitive skills, not as abilities the students should possess. Use AI as a pedagogical object to be critiqued, interrogated, not as a behavior that is forbidden. And build a moment of metacognitive reflection into every task, so students can learn to watch their own thinking, how they're thinking. If we are designing curriculums, my fellow educators, right? So we can align our learning outcomes on these higher order cognition skills across the whole degree, not within an isolated course, right? So obviously we do that more or less, right? From semester 1 to the last semester. We sequence the instruction so that it spans semesters rather than compressing it into one. Institutions need to understand we need faculty development. Thanks to the organizers, they are organizing a conference to exchange these ideas in this manner, right? More such conferences are required, and move institutional policy beyond detection and penalty towards a cognitive education. And no, I'm not done. I have 2 more slides to go. Thank you. The reframing of India's universities. What do our universities need? India does not lack ambition. No. We have IITs, the finest in the world. Central universities with real distinctions, right? Universities with national missions on artificial intelligence. What we need is not a machinery, but a shift on how we think about integrity itself. So from policing to teaching, right? And the vocabulary we use about plagiarism, it shapes our institutions that we are building to address. So speak of plagiarism as theft, and you build a constabulary. A constabulary is actually an official police force responsible for maintaining law and order. No, we don't have to do that. Speak of it as a fraud, and you will build a courtroom. Speak of it, as I'm asking you to speak of it, as a cognitive shortfall, and you will build a school, an institution. So we don't have to look at plagiarism as the culprit. No, it is a cognitive shortfall. Indian universities, by their statutes and by their better instincts, should behave like this. Ambedkar, in his Annihilation of Caste, did not summarize the arguments of others. He confronted them. He built something new. Amartya Sen, in development as freedom did not retrieve received wisdom. He reframed it. That is scholarship. Scholarship is the opposite of plagiarism, not because it obeys the rules, but because it thinks. Last slide for today. Let me end where I began. When a student plagiarizes, what is it that they truly lack? Not in most cases integrity, no. Not in most cases character. What they lack is the slow, taught, painstaking built capacity to read a difficult text, hold position against another, produce a sentence that is genuinely their own. That capacity is the inheritance of every educated person, and it is what our classrooms exist to transmit. No detector will ever produce it. No regulation will ever require it. Only teaching does that work. So let us teach our students to think, and the copying will take care of itself. Beyond copy paste lies no better detection, no better penalty. Beyond copy paste lies pure scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dalal, for your illuminating presentation and at least advocating from the side of the students. I can best sum up your presentation that the most effective antidote to plagiarism is not surveillance but education that prioritizes thinking.